Great.
Well, Katherine Deves, welcome to the NatCon Australia podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on, Dan.
No sweat. Hey, I wanted to talk to you about more than just the gender stuff, but it would be obviously remiss not to mention it, considering you've just been involved in a very high profile case mentioned everywhere except the ABC, and it's consumed a large part of your life the last
Yeah.
couple of years. So,
Mhm.
without getting too deep in the weeds, how do you think the appeal went, and what happens next?
So we were in front of the full court of the federal court just last week. So we had three judges, and we were appealing at first decision in front of Justice Bromwich, which was the federal court. So look, I mean, we had Sal Grover and Giggle. She had the Lesbian Action Group who had intervened on behalf of lesbians because they'd received an unfavourable decision where they were told by the Australian Human Rights Commission, the AHRC, that they were not entitled to have an exemption for biological females who are sexually attracted to other biological females to have their events. They were told they had to include what they call trans women, which is basically men who claim to be women. So they have an interest. Then we also had on the other side, we had the Sex Discrimination Commissioner. Now they are amicus. They have a statutory right to be there with litigation and decisions that affect the Sex Discrimination Act. However, they and Tickle were broadly aligned on pretty much all the arguments. And we
Which
also
you knew
had
would be which you knew would be the case, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's what happened at first instance. And then we also had Equality Australia intervene pretty much at the 11th hour. And look, when we looked at the submissions on the other side, there was a lot of discussion around ideology, philosophy. Um, Whereas with our arguments, we pretty much stuck to statutory construction and the problems when you remove definitions, and that sort of thing. So I know that when we came out, the client um, was very buoyant, and she felt that her arguments had been properly represented. So we fought for the definition of the word man and woman, and the problems that have arisen when you've removed those, and also the special measure arguments. So to achieve substantive equality between one of the protected characteristics, which is men and women. So Giggle being a special measure, and if that is found, then it means that it doesn't even fall into the discrimination framework. So there is no direct or indirect discrimination. But the way the other side were trying to argue it were that if you have a special measure for one of the protected characteristics, it only serves to not be discrimination for that particular characteristic. So if you have a special measure between man and woman, but a trans woman who, like Giggle is saying, Tickle's been excluded on the basis of his biological sex, he's arguing he was excluded on the basis of his gender identity. So it means that if you have this special measure and anybody else is cause discrimination on any other protected attribute, then it doesn't, it fails the threshold and is discrimination. So whereas what we're arguing is if you have this special measure, um, for, substantive equality between men and women, even if it causes detriment to one of the other protected characteristics, it doesn't matter because it doesn't meet that threshold where it can then be considered discrimination. So it's a bit of a legalese argument, but very important for
Mm.
female-only spaces and services, because if you have something on the basis of biological sex, then any trans woman could come along and make a complaint and say they've been excluded, and then effectively the entire discrimination framework just implodes. So it's pointless. What's the point of having
I
it?
mean, it's clear the legalese and the procedure and the different arguments that are made all pop the top of lawyers, no doubt. But in essence, I don't think anyone really understood. Well, some clear activists did, but when they were inserting gender in the Federal Discrimination Act, I don't think the vast majority of people truly understand the kind of madness that would result from that. Is that your gut feel?
Look, my understanding is that I think everyone just, they want to be kind. It was sold to them as the next civil rights movement. We were a little bit ahead of the game because it was put in 2013. Trans only sort of started to go on its trajectory globally around 2015. So, when I sort of figured it out in 2016, 2017, I thought, oh my God, they've actually already put it into our federal legislation. And nobody, there wasn't some massive debate. I mean, to fundamentally change the definition of sex and say that a woman is anything, anyone who wants to be one. I mean, that is a huge conversation, and that, did not take place. But I think in looking at all the sort of parliamentary papers and the extrinsic materials, they did not turn their mind to what it
Yeah.
would do to women. They just didn't. So it was a massive failure of imagination. They just didn't even conceive of the impact on others. And whenever you change sort of human rights law, it is a balancing act. And, where women's rights, trans rights, well, trans demands, as I like to put them, they're trampling all over women's rights. And when you have a right that takes away somebody else's fundamental right, then it's not just.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I get it. So much of this vocab is contested, right? I think when people think, even many ways, think trans, they think Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, drag queen in the particular part of town. They don't fully understand this this amorphous changing category. They don't really understand the gender, what precisely that means, and how it differs, if at all, and even whether we should use that term because it leads to no end of confusion. What's your best explanation? And I know you must have thought about this at length, for why such insane ideas, like, for example, that there can be such a thing as a pregnant man, or that men can change their sex to become women, or that men who identify as women should be able to play in women's sport. Why have they now become such dogma amongst many on in Australia today?
Well, it's very cultish thinking, and I think, people are very slavish to it, and they see that it's on the right side of history and it's on the good side, and anybody who says no to that, they're picturing, their 15-year-old daughter who has a friend who's struggling with her sexuality and identifies as non-binary. They're not thinking of the 6'3", 50-year-old bloke, wearing a tutu, trying to come into, the change rooms, at Kmart, at Warringah Mall. That they don't wanna picture that. It's confronting and it's ugly, and people, turn a blind eye, but it's sort of, it's now this culture war, and it's been cast as good or evil. It's been cast as left or right, or conservative or progressive or whatever. So people have literally staked their claim. And I mean, there's so much money involved, there's reputations involved, there's funding involved. And now people also see what happens when you speak publicly. You'll have your reputation destroyed. They'll issue death threats to your children. They'll try to get you fired. They'll publicly dox you. I mean, we all see examples of that. And I mean, I've been a case in point,
Mm,
when I was in the firing line in 2022. Um, but I think, and also, you have to confront the fact that, when we look at what they've done to children in lying to them about biological sex,
yeah.
and the children who've been medically transitioned, the parents who've done that to their children and robbed them of, healthy sexual functioning, their fertility, having a healthy, long life, because of the hormones or the surgeries and all the complications. I mean, those parents are going to have to face up to the fact they have committed a grievous human rights atrocity against their own child, and they're not going to, that they're
And
the
in
people who are
fairness,
never going to come back from that.
and it's often under the direction of the doctors. I have actually a little bit more sympathy for the parents because they can be, they're taking it on faith that the doctor knows best, and that they risking the health of and life of their child potentially in many cases. So I do sort of understand the horrible, many cases, the horrible situation they've found themselves in. It's not just the left though, right? Because it
Mm,
has been interesting, the divide. People who at least traditionally consider themselves on the left, like J.K. Rowling and Germaine Greer, they
mm.
have broken differently to people like Julia Gillard, and our friends up here, Anastasia Palaszczuk and Sharon Fentiman. What do you think explains that divide?
So with those women, like Gillard, I mean, I just don't think she thought it through. And now that she's staked her claim, I mean, it's reputation, and it's also, I mean, this ideology is embedded throughout our councils, our state parliament, our federal parliament, all the government departments. I mean, people's jobs rely on going along with the lie. So, what is it? A man will believe anything if his salary depends on it, as they say. And people just sort of don't want the hassle, but that's until, it's their granddaughter who's having to play against a boy in soccer, or, their mum who is in a nursing home who's now got, 6 foot Nancy coming in, who's really Fred, to do their intimate care for their mother, their elderly mother. And they're like, oh, well, hang on a second here. But now that we've got all these policies in place, and indeed like draconian laws where you can be charged with hate speech and vilification and even criminally charged. And then also sort of underlying that, which people don't want to look at because it is really dark and ugly, is the fact that, for a lot of men, particularly middle-aged men who are coming out of the closet and announcing themselves to be women, it is driven as a fetish known as autogynephilia. Um, these men, they become, they come across it in porn. A lot of people came out after COVID because they've been stuck at home watching porn, and they've been led to believe that they think they're women. They wanted to cross-dress full time, and we see with the trans widow cohort, so the women who've lost their husbands to this ideology, blowing up their families, spending all the family wealth to do all their surgery and buy all their dresses, and humiliating and embarrassing the children. And these men often have a lot of resource and a lot of power, and you don't want to stand in the way of a guy who's like in the full throes of a fetish. Like, people just don't want to face up to that, because it's dark and it's ugly and it's awful.
Yeah, it's not the sort of thing you necessarily won't read on the front page of the paper, but this is it. This is in the mix. This is what is part of what's driving it. Can't turn away.
Yeah.
Hey, you first came, I think, to national prominence, at least to my attention, when you ran as a candidate for the federal seat of Warringah. And there was an incredible media pylon at the time. It was, and I'm sure
Mm.
I don't explain that to you, but even from a distance, I was going, "My God, what is this?" And um, it was interesting because I thought that, uh, there was criticism externally from, I guess, the usual suspects. There's also some like internal party critics who always go on the name. What do you think
Mm.
explains that? Because I would have thought the centre right in Australia would have been, you've got this candidate who's professionally accomplished, running all the rest of it. Why? What is it? Just standard backbiting? Feel like there was a little bit more to it than that, right?
Look, I think it came down to sort of, factional positions, the sort of
Mm.
moderates or progressives, as they like to call themselves, which I think is a misnomer, wanted to distance themselves. Because at that time, 3, 4 years ago, people were seeing this as an attack on LGBTIQA plus rights, which
Yeah.
it isn't. I mean, LGB, there's many in LGB who want to have a divorce from the TQ plus,
Yeah.
because that's all identity, and sexual orientation is actually, biology. Um, and I think that people were just terrified. I don't know, they felt very threatened by what I said. And look, I mean, I've been making comments on Twitter. Many people had not seen the arguments framed in that term. They didn't even realize there was pushback. Um, and yeah, they just sort of leapt to their own defense. They wanted to signal to their progressive followers, oh, look, I'm not going to be supporting this woman. She's saying that they're surgically mutilating and sterilizing children. And I was like, well, they actually, I mean, that's the fact. The story is what I've said.
Yeah.
It's the story behind what I've said, not the words that I said. Um, and then obviously within the party, I mean, my view is, had I had the opportunity to just take all the media inquiries, do all the interviews, knock it over 24, 36, 48-hour media cycle, I felt confident that I could have rebutted or engaged in any arguments, and just put the information on the table and people could make up their own minds. But I wasn't, and then we could have shifted, but instead it just, just got whipped into a frenzy because I wasn't able to say anything. I had people sort of going out and trying to argue on my behalf, but oftentimes they sort of didn't quite get the arguments, and they didn't get it right, and they just added to the mess.
Mm.
And I think it would have taken the heat out of what was happening. That's my view. But it,
Mm.
it didn't work out that way. So it just turned into this whole maelstrom of just It was crazy, you know, I'm getting chased in a car by paparazzi, there's paparazzi chasing my kids on the way to school, like, it was crazy.
Insane stuff. I mean,
Yeah,
it's crazy type of politics, this gender politics. Your case reminds me of Mark Stein, the UK columnist, who I'm sure you know. He says it's you're never rewarded for being right too early in politics, and I feel
well,
like 2022 was probably too early for it to sort of properly permeate the consciousness. And but it is an electoral winner. I mean, at least I'm led to believe it is an electoral winner in the US,
yeah.
and because there's logic on your side, I think eventually it will be a political winner in Australia too. Was it actually the reason you got involved in party politics, or was it just a whole host of reasons, and this was just an extra issue that you decided to come in on?
Look, I have a long family history in politics. My great-grandfather was a framer of the Constitution. He was a constitutional barrister back then. He was the youngest senator in the first federal parliament. You know, my mum grew up in Canberra and also Manhattan. She's always been around politics. My dad would have been a history professor, but he did medicine instead. So we grew up having conversations about history and politics. So I always had a great interest, but I sort of went off on a different career path. Traveled around. I lived in the States for a long time. I worked mostly in the wine industry. And then I came back to Australia and I had my daughters and I decided to do law. And, you know, I thought I need to brush up on my feminism. And I found out feminism had gone completely awry and what had happened with liberal feminism. And then I saw what was happening with trans. Then I saw what was happening with women's sport, and I felt compelled to speak out because I realized nobody was speaking to the little girls. And I'd sort of dipped in and out of the Liberal Party, you know, sort of having membership over the years. And then I came across a group of women who were trying to put together a policy with respect to what was being done to children. And I thought I really should rejoin the party. And then they kept asking for people to put their hand up for Warringah. And I thought, well, maybe this is the time. So I did, and the rest is history.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Warringah is interesting because it's one of the first so-called Teal seats to fall,
Mm.
formerly Blue Ribbon seat. You've been, I think, more articulate than almost anyone I've heard about the Teal phenomenon. And I heard you describe the psychology of ambitious, affluent professional women and why they are particularly gravitated to these types of candidates. Why is that? If you don't mind restating it.
Well, I know everyone was just sort of dismissing them as doctors' wives, you know, a few years ago, and I think that it's not that simplistic. I think in these sorts of areas where the Teals have been successful, you do have these women who, you know, they've been very well educated. They've gone off, they've gotten their degrees. They might have had a private school education, which is, you know, very costly and quite intense. And then, you know, they've embarked on their career. And for one reason or another, whether their husband's career started to eclipse theirs or they've had kids and they've had to take a step back, but they've sort of always been brought up to believe, oh, you can have it all and you're going to change the world. But you know, the reality of life gets in the way. So these women have now got kids who are off in primary school or high school or indeed even off in college, and they sort of go, "Oh, I forgot to change the world, but I've got all this skill set." And then here was the Teals to give them a reason. And look, their thinking is very, the way they operate is very, very cultish. You know, when you're in the in group. And, you know, I was hearing stories during my campaign that there'd sort of been mothers groups that were affiliated with certain girls, you know, high level girls' schools. And if the mums didn't demonstrate their allegiance to Zali, they'd be excluded from coffee mornings and things like that. So, you know, and the way they ran their campaigns, it's very militaristic. You know, you always had someone very officious with their clipboard ticking people off, and they had their shifts. And, you know, there was speculation that people were actually being paid, but it was giving people who might not have ever been engaged in politics or really have a reason to get up in the morning because the kids are off and they're quite well to do. It was giving them a purpose, being part of the group. And here's your job. Your job is to ride your e-bike with your Zali t-shirt on up and down Military Road like a moving billboard. Your job is to go and sit and take up a big table at Buena Vista and sit there just having, lemonades all day long with your Zali t-shirts on and complaining about, the Katherine Deves golf flutes that the owner hung on the veranda. It is very well organized, well-oiled machine. They'd show up with their Teal cupcakes
Mm,
and all the rest of it. So I think it gave people a reason, and people a reason to feel included. So look, I totally get that. And then obviously they had their sort of dark ops where they'd be going around, ripping down core flutes, and you had people who were very aggressive on the ground. Some really appalling behaviour.
mm,
Um, a lot of the other candidates and their supporters, quite collegiate because we're obviously all interested in politics. You'd have friendly debates and chats, and you'd see the same people. But the Teals would always be off on their own. You'd sort of say hi to them, and they'd look at you sideways. And it's like, oh, come on, like we're all engaged in the democratic process here. But and then also people who would come along and be quite provocative and inflammatory and try to get rises out of people. So particularly on my team, and then maybe if someone fires back, then they're like, oh, "You've just threatened me. I'm going to go and tell the electoral commission, and I'm dobbing on you, and I might have to call the police." Like we had a few of those, and it was like, "What the hell?" Like you've been at this person,
mm.
provoking them all day and actually saying quite horrible things to them. And when they finally crack, then you're like, oh, so they definitely do play dirty.
Yeah. I mean, say what you will, they have been incredibly lethally effective
Yeah.
at taking over the blue ribbon seats of the Liberal Party, which are held in most
Oh,
cases since the end of the Second World War, right? And it's somewhat of a unique Australian phenomenon, this non-party which coordinates. And they are, again, say what you will, but I recognize the type. You meet them in corporate Australia every day of the week. And they're very disciplined. It's not like
mm,
United Australia Party or God knows what, Pauline, where people tend to spit the dummy and then set up their own new party, and they're on message. The message, yes, it's completely vacuous and in most cases, and that it's meaningless in many cases. And people, they don't actually, I think it's what you're intimating, they don't actually really engage in policy.
no,
It's
that's
very
right.
much sort of like, well, virtue signaling's been overused, but that's it. It's about the image, and then the details. Oh, it's pesky, and we don't even want debate because everyone knows the right answer. It's just, and how do you counter that? That.
Yeah. Well, I get into the weeds with some of their volunteers, and you sort of, you hear them say, try and convince someone that a hung parliament is a good idea, and you'd say, well, why do you say that? And they're like, well, we're holding the government to account. And you start drilling down, and then they go, oh, just go and get my supervisor. Like I had one. This was in the council elections, and I know they're not supposed to be party aligned, but we know who's aligned with who.
Mm.
And she said, "Oh, I'm such and such as, I'm here for the candidate." And I said, "Oh, what do they stand for?" They said, "Oh, the climate." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And she went, "Oh, I know." And I said, "No, genuinely, what do you mean you stand for the climate? What does the policy mean?" And I started point, and then they sort of just fall to pieces because they're unused to actually being sort of prosecuted on that. And I wouldn't necessarily do it to upset them, but just so because other people always listen when you're in the line and you sort of say, look, these people don't actually know what they're talking about. So you just sort of try and highlight that. But another thing that they're very good at, which unfortunately I think we're seeing with the Liberal Party not being very good at, which is the digital space. I mean, the Libs are still, I think I saw something the other day where they're spending, 3 to 1 on still print media, which is and
I think I
mail
saw that
outs, which is
story too.
archaic.
Yeah. Mm.
Whereas, the Teals are incredibly good at all the different platforms. And also when there was pushback or criticism of one of their candidate, we used to call them the army of flying monkeys, the people behind the keyboard. Someone would criticize such and such, and then all of a sudden there'd be a dog pile on the person who asked the question. So whatever the criticism was would get buried. So they were very, very good at that.
Yeah. They do remind me of corporate Australia to a certain extent because, um, despite what some people might think, the corporate boards of this world are very much sort of quasi green teal aligned, and they don't really consider they're much of a debate about politics. It's there's
Mm,
there this is the message, and they're very good at the branding, and then they'll get the PR people to roll it out, and technically skilled at the digital stuff, and it all just rolls. And to be raising questions or talking about cost benefits and all sort of stuff, that just gets in the way of the product rollout, don't you know? And
yeah.
and I do recognize that in them, and the people, they are fit and healthy, and walk around
Mm,
and smile and photogenic in many cases, like corporate Australia is. But it's almost as though they sell themselves as the anti-politics party in a way, right? That
mm,
not they're not going to dirty themselves by engaging in the messy business of arguing details. And um yeah, so how do we beat these guys? I mean, there are issues which can cut through. One of them,
mhm,
which you've raised, is and increasingly mentioned, I think, um, does actually have resonance, and that's immigration.
mhm.
Um, I is it possible to explain or get these people to appreciate that mass immigration, as it's currently practiced in Australia, does actually pose a kind of existential risk to women and professional women in their suburbs eventually?
Oh, look, it doesn't really fit their narrative, but, just going back to how we're gonna, get rid of the Teals, I don't look, I don't know, I think they're pretty rusted on now, particularly in Warringah, say, but I think as people really start to realise that, when you've got a member on the crossbench, they can't do a lot, they can only get things across the line if the party in government allows them to do it. Um, and I think people might just start to get a bit fed up with that. I mean, the climate scam, people are starting to realise the cost of this, that it is a sham. So I think, as people start to wake up to those kinds of things, and just get tired of it. Um, but with respect to immigration, I mean, the Teals tend to stay away from that. But
Mm,
I think I mean, you just can't keep ignoring it. As we know, we're all acutely aware of the number of people who are arriving. And, of course, I'll preface this by saying, most Australians do not object to immigration, provided it's orderly, it's not rapid, it's not massive, we're able to absorb the numbers these people are going to assimilate. And that is simply what is not happening. And as you're pointing out, the burden of this is not being borne by the people in Warringah and Wentworth. It's by the people in the outer suburbs, where a lot of the immigrants are going to. It's also, we're going to see this more and more with women, Australian women who've been brought up in a country where it's free, where they have rights equal to men, where they can walk around in their bikinis at the beach, where they can walk around at night unaccompanied. And
mm,
it has to be said that when we bring in men from cultures that, even countries that do not have the rule of law, not in the way that we understand it, where it is just tribal law, there are people running around with machetes. Women are treated within that cultural and religious dynamic. Women are not seen as equal to men. They are second class citizens. They are reproductive chattel. And we've got people coming in who do not have a Western education, and from cultures where they have that view. And then they arrive here and they see all the free Australian women walking around. And we're seeing this play out in the UK at the moment. What do we honestly think is going to happen? It is so naive to think that rapes and sexual assaults and so forth will not start to go up as these cultures literally clash. And we're
mm,
seeing that in UK and Europe where, rape is through the roof. You've got those horrible grooming gangs in the UK, which is
mm.
just the most grotesque. I've called it sexual genocide. I mean, it's basically, a human rights atrocity. Um, I haven't heard reports of it happening here to this extent, but it's certainly we are seeing immigrants who are coming from, particular countries, and they are raping women and girls, and their criminal culpability is even being mitigated because, they don't understand within the context of their own culture. So what? They get a slap on the wrist because of that. To me, that would be even more reason to deport. I'm sorry, if you are in this country and you don't respect our rules and our customs, you should not be here.
Yeah, I mean, Constantine Kissin, who's a podcast from the UK, I'm sure you know. when he came to Australia, he made the point that Australia is 10 years um, behind the UK, but he meant that in a positive way because we
Mm.
haven't yet seen the full consequences that they've experienced yet. But that was, a year and a half ago, and
Yeah,
it still surprises me that even among the political class and very well connected people, they don't see the train coming down the track. It is possible
yeah,
to avoid this and act now, but there's no sign of any um, you know, real cutting of the numbers. And we have a fantastic magical kind of culture, but it doesn't, which can assimilate a whole lot of different people in different ways, but it's
yeah.
not infinite, and it can't just at some point that the magic will crack. It doesn't can't
Mhm.
absorb
It has.
everything so quickly, right? So
Yeah.
it's yeah, how to get through. But the other thing I think it's important though is, and I think you might have mentioned it as well, in the US, that's amongst the so-called new right and Trump and the online right, there was amongst that movement a new style. Um,
Mhm.
it was fashionable and hip, and it was edgy. And I don't think in Australia on the centre right have been able to incorporate that in any way, shape, or form yet. And you can't beat these guys who operate purely on style with nothing. You got to fight fire with fire. Do you think that's a fair point?
Absolutely agree. When I was over there in March and I went to CPAC and you see all the people who are there and I mean, you get the ordinary people, but there is a real glamorous, aspirational element to it. I think it was best encapsulated by that New Yorker cover that was very
Yeah.
Slim Aaron aesthetic with those young kids at that event. And it was sort of like harking back to Wall Street 1980s sort of fashion and vibe and aesthetic. And yeah, that certainly hasn't been replicated in Australia. We're not really, I mean, we don't have that extraordinary wealth like they do
Mm.
in the United States, but they've made conservatism cool again. I mean, you just have to go on socials and see all those girls at the sororities doing their funky little dance in their cowboy boots, having a great time, like really embracing their sort of femininity, shall I say? And we just sort of I don't know, we have a bit of, I don't know if it's the cultural cringe down here a bit, but I mean, America culturally, obviously, they're always a little bit ahead of us. But I think when we look at, say, the millennials, but when we're looking more to like the Zoomers and the Alphas, I mean, how are they going to rebel against the generation before them? I'm sort of Gen X, and then you got the Boomers, but the millennials, it was sort of like they embraced all this mad progressivism, climatism, identitarianism. The Gen Xers and the Boomers were all sort of, partying and rock and roll and drugs and, just
Mm.
doing the opposite of what your parents wanted. But Alpha and Zoomers, I suspect to be cool, to be rebellious, you're going to be conservative,
And I
embrace
think
conservative values.
that's their kind of Achilles heel with these teals because fundamentally they're kind of daggy. Like their brand is very thin, and like you said, when pushed, they get reactive. If it's a competition between, I'm going to be mean, but like if it's a competition between glamorous New York nice nightclub with young people, or blue haired, or aging boomer who thinks they're being hip by embracing the teals, it's no contest. But we don't fight that fight. We kind
Mm,
of like we don't even get involved. Like if you want a culture war, you actually need to be in creating culture. Not
yeah.
there's a variety of different culture wars. In one sense, it is. It is important to fight culture wars, but it's different to the gender stuff. It's more a new style. So people look at the center right anew in the way they have in the United States. Like the Republicans were a daggy brand
Mm,
pre-Trump, and
yeah.
they've changed, right? But
Oh,
so we're looking
100%.
at trendy North Shore to lead it, Catherine.
Well, no, I'm really enamored with this. I mean, you look at the American Eagle, the recent campaign with Sydney Sweeney, I mean, she is just all woman, and obviously the left are having um, conniptions about that. But like when you had Trump's inauguration and just the stylized fashion, and when you looked at his daughter Ivanka and her family, like it was just absolutely stole within an inch of its life. It was magnificent, and it was something to really aspire to, and you see, like, whatever you think of Trump, the fact that he's still on speaking terms with his exes, that he has all these kids who are still surround him, he's got all these grandchildren, he's got this beautiful wife. It's like, if you're a young man to look at that, it's like, why wouldn't want to aspire to that? To
And
being a
it's not
very
just,
successful man with
I
a
mean,
beautiful, loving family.
but it's not just him who's king of the brand in many ways, but it's the whole culture around, like the online
Yeah.
right in the US and everything else it's not, yes, it's Trump and he's posting in to some extent, but it's much more, I mean, countercultural's overused, but that is what it is.
Mm.
And no
Yeah.
one thinks Barack Obama is the hippest dude in the room anymore, where
Mm.
they once might have done in 2008.
Mm. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, how to generate that here? Because I think we were both at ARC, and there's good looking. We're pound for pound better looking, smarter. We probably throw better dinner parties than any of the left as well. But that is not coming through Liberal Party
Mhm.
brand at the moment. And I think to beat these, the metropolitan set, you actually have to kind of mix it with them in that area.
Yeah, I think, and just the way they also frame the family. I mean, you got JD Vance coming out, with his wife who looked at him so adoringly, on the day of the inauguration, and his beautiful kids, and he brings them along, and it's sort of just making all of that cool again. But I guess maybe in Australia we don't also have that countercultural media. We've got, ABC and SBS.
We
But I mean, I
Yes.
guess that's mainstream, sort of old media, which is dying anyway. But I mean, and you get criticisms around like trad fem, as in trad feminists or trad wives or whatever. But I really do think that there is starting to be a resurgence with the younger people, because it's the only way they
But
can
on
rebel.
on the gender stuff, I mean,
Mm.
why people in the political class can't see the opportunity when you had that incredible photo, like with Trump signing his executive orders, surrounded by all these like girl, cheering it on with this. Her name's escaped me. Miley Gaines, right? The swimmer.
Riley
Um,
Gaines, yes, yeah.
Miley Gaines, sorry, and all those young kids, and it's just like we could do the same thing here in Queensland,
Mm.
where we have like centre right. You could have an incredible photo op. You could have really sympathetic gay guys from who are anti this stuff. You could have, the Katherine Deves of the world. You could have the, Moira Deemy. You could have a real kind of pageant. Kids who've, suffered horrifically because of it, and you could sell that. But if you're constantly on the defensive, both in arguments and you're in sort of damage mitigation mode, and you're not putting them on the defensive, then you're going to look like a kind of you're going to look shady, and you're not going to be. And I might bring people along with you. Yeah,
Yeah, look, I think I mean, it does perplex me because it is political low-hanging fruit. I don't know if it's cravenness or a lack of understanding. I mean, unfortunately, because of what has happened around certain cases, legal cases here, it has been sort of somewhat political poison. I mean, we look at what happened down in Victoria, it's probably made many politicians very, very shy about even touching this issue. But we need to have Australia's Riley Gaines, but we need to have our Leah Thomas. And in my experience, the women and families who are being really impacted by this, they are terrified to speak up because they see how badly you do get um, excoriated and vilified and so forth. But I mean, the conversation has changed. Um, and I think as we start to see, I mean, Kira Lee Smith, she's going through the courts. Moira Deeming was vindicated. Giggle, we've probably got 3 to 6 months until the decision. And then if it goes to the High Court, whether that is Sal who appeals because the decision's unfavourable, or the other side, it is likely that special leave will be applied for. Um, and then obviously, hopefully, we have a resounding win. If we don't, then it needs to be punted back to the legislature to have that fight. But yeah, we do need people to be standing up. And for someone like Riley Gaines, I mean, she has become a household name. I think she's created huge personal wealth for herself. She's married. She's got a baby girl on the way. So I would hope that there would be some young women in Australia who would see that and start to be able to feel confident enough to put their stories out there.
When it
Um,
breaks, it's gonna break hard. We've also got the, uh, Dr. Gillian Spencer's, court cases, which may eventually be decided at some stage up here too,
yeah.
which would be nice to have, like, a could be the first win, like a big win, so
Yes.
let's see. Hey, well, we've got a terrible election loss for the centre right in Australia last time around. Arguably, lots of things just broke the wrong way and was not decisive. And there's so much dynamism in other parts of the world. We've seen new parties arise. We've seen existing parties completely transformed. And yet here, um, it's almost amazing how much we haven't changed in some ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, the centre right has definitely gone backwards, and we have the rise of all these sort of smaller on the right parties. I mean, the Liberal Party, in my opinion, still hasn't had its come to Jesus moment. Like we've still got, the sort of the moderates and the cons, and you've got people who are there who would rather see the party fail than
Mm,
allow a candidate that they perceive to be on in a different faction be successful. They would rather not be in government than allow, the Conservatives to be the dominant faction within the party. Um, and, this ridiculous idea that we have to be Labor light or out Teal the Teals, we're not going to, they need to let go of that. And I think people want a point of difference, and we need to be very clear and firm on our policies. We can't be chasing what Labor, if people want to vote Labor or Teal, they're going to vote Labor or Teal. You know, so what I think we should do is have very clear, definitive policies on some of these really sticky issues like immigration, like trans, whatever, and you just hold the line on it.
mm,
And eventually people will look for an alternative because obviously we know with what Labor and Teals are doing, it's not going to help the country. And when people realize that, they'll be looking for the alternative. So we have to be standing there ready to provide them with that option. I mean, that's my view. But I mean, I was very encouraged to see the Libs come out against the position on Gaza and recognizing Palestine as a state. I thought, oh, thank God, finally they've actually stood up to
mm,
the government and acted like the opposition.
mm,
Um, so that was encouraging. I mean, it was a bit of a messy start when they were getting distracted by gender quotas and welcome to countries. I was like, oh, God, really? I mean, we should just be saying the opposite to Labor. No, everyone's sick to death of welcome to countries. Just say no, it needs to come to an end. Um, and the fluffery around gender quotas, I'm like, oh, for God's sake, can we just move on from that conversation? I mean, people should be there on merit. Um,
mm.
and nothing else, in my view. And can we just get on with the business of running the country?
And when you bring the gravitas of the main political party to an issue, you can actually change. Even though you're out of government, you can change the conversation and even get the government to focus on something different. I'm like you. I just think not only is it frustrating the whole Labor light thing, it's completely out of step with where the centre right globally is going. People talk about like
Yeah.
effectively like David Cameronizing the Liberal Party, and we need to go and read Theresa May's speech from 2002 about the nasty party. I mean, I've lost count of the number of people who've said that. And I say to these guys, have you picked up a British newspaper lately? No one sensible in Westminster is talking about David Cameron being the future. No one in France, no one in Italy,
Yes.
no one in Germany, no one in the United States. Who is apart from a few
Mm.
provincial libs here in Australia? It's kind of bizarre the time warp they're stuck in. What do you
Mm.
think the top three political issues should be in the lead up to the next federal election, Catherine?
I think it should be immigration.
Mm,
And then, there's sort of few moving parts, but, the replacement rate and how we're assisting, families and young women. I mean, that sort of rolls over into childcare. That's a
mm,
whole other conversation you can have. But, throwing more billions at childcare is not an answer because the knock on effect of that is whether we like it or not, these kids who are put in daycare very young, they end up with mental health problems and behavioural problems. And I think that's manifesting now. So that needs to be absolutely dealt with. And the other pressing thing is, it's housing because if we don't have young people getting into houses, if they don't feel they have a piece of the action, they have something to conserve, they won't be pair bonding, they won't be having babies, they won't be building wealth. So I think, they're sort of all intertwined, but I think they would be our most pressing issues. And then further to that, I would also say, productivity, manufacturing. Like, what the hell is going on? We can't just have a nation of, this bloated public service. The government just throwing as many roadblocks and as many taxes in the way of private sector that's just stifling innovation, stifling people who want to start businesses. So we really need to have a revamp of all of that. I think, in my view. I mean, and we've got really serious big problems, and it just seems like they're just tinkering around the edges most of the time and going, "Oh, we're going to spend on this, or we're going to do this," or, just these sort of fluffy, "Oh, we're going to pay off some of these student loans," and you're just like, "Well, how does that help anybody? That's just a band-aid slip. That's just buying votes.
Yeah,
How is
it's
that
gonna get.
actually helping young people sort of become wealthy and financially independent and get their foot on the property ladder? It's just a nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, there's some radicalization building in Australia because people who have done everything right, you know, worked hard, gone to uni and stuff, they can't have what their parents expected. And so
Yeah,
if it's not, I think Tucker Carlson, not exactly the radical, although who knows, he said if it's not, if you can't have a situation where someone can work hard and have a legitimate expectation of forming a family, but in a house somewhere, in a reasonable
mm,
place, like not like, whatever, out past Baloo, but it's like 23, 24. Well, they'll be like, well, the system's not working, stuff that, flip the monopoly board. That's
yeah,
'cause it's not working. So actually do get that radicalism, but it just needs to be channeled in a proper way and not into whatever Free Palestine or God knows what else,
yeah.
other craziness under the sun.
Well, yeah, all these isms that are sort of creeping in. I mean, I appreciate that we are a secular society and most people have sort of stepped away from organized religion, but I don't think we thought through what would actually be filling that void because people want a sense of community. They want to believe in something bigger than themselves. So now we have, I mean, right now it's, the Free Palestine movement, but it's been climatism, it was Ukraine, it was transgenderism, it was
Yeah,
LGBTIQA plus. It's all these sort of impoverished ideas. And oftentimes, with these, I like Islamism, for example, but they're very unforgiving. There's sort of no redemption. You step out of line, you're sort of excommunicated. It's like there's just they don't create art, they don't create music, they don't create hope. There's not sort of any sort of longevity. It's just whatever the cause du jour is. And
yeah.
I think people are just getting caught up in it because they've got nothing else. And I don't know. I just think at the end of the day, it's kind of devoid of meaning. I mean, really, what is marching across the Sydney Harbour Bridge going to do to change things in Palestine, in that part of the world? Like, let's be honest, nothing. It really isn't. And I just find it like I'm not saying to people, oh, well, you should be going off to church or whatever, but although I think p- attendance at church is actually increasing. Um, Young people, particularly, and not going to sort of the happy clapper churches, but actually the old style, very traditional, very ritualistic church services. Apparently, that's been increasing in the UK because people are seeking meaning. So that's sort of
Yep.
going back to the youth, coming back to tradition. But I think that's also really dangerous. All these sort of ideologies that people are being captured by because they're just not helpful.
It gives them an emotional buzz. It gives them a transiency sense of community. But like you say, it's very it doesn't brook any dissent. There's no
Mm,
forgiveness element to it. There's no. It's all virtue signaling too. Like you say what you will. The church. You go there. You confess your sins. They're not
yeah,
like this, they're parading their virtue when in whatever cause they embrace. It's a very different dynamic going on, but it is powerful. And in the absence of something else, people will latch onto that, and especially with atomized society, that's it's a phenomenon, right? In a way that I don't think we fully
yeah,
appreciate the kind of the uniqueness of that. Wasn't always the case that people were latching on to these causes, um, like you say, like the next new thing. You have to all be for it, or you're cast out. So yeah, it's a sort of volatile, dangerous situation, really. The way that people can be mobilized in that way for whatever reason happens to be embraced by I don't know, the PR agents or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, with religion, like, there is that element of accountability as well, like accountability to community, accountability to the God. Um, Whereas I think with some of these ideologies, I mean, your virtue is just in, showing up and saying all the things. It's just sort of
You're counting
it's
the
very
the
superficial.
marketing mantra. Yeah, that's right. And there's no depth to it too. What next for you? This is a final question. Where are you when when this court case finally comes to an end? You're articulate. I've heard you talk about all sorts of different subjects, and we haven't even covered half of them today. But where do you run again? Do you keep pumping out media of some description to try and change the dynamic? Do you start a new cultural trend wave, which is the new right in Australia? What do you do?
Oh, yeah, that does pique my interest, but, at the moment, so I work for a law firm, so I am a day-to-day solicitor, mostly in various forms of litigation. The Giggle versus Tickle. I also have a few other matters that are running that are sort of in the culture war space. And one thing that I am working on at the moment is a strategic public litigation fighting fund. So
Mm,
raising money through a company limited by guarantee, common sense defence. So when people not only have to defend themselves when they're captured for hate speech, vilification, whatever, but also to be very strategic and pick some fights ourselves. I am so sick of our people always being the respondent or the defendant. I would like to look at where we think policy is not right, incorrect, and figure out ways where we can actually go after it, whether it's through sort of judicial reviews of administrative decisions, but actually start to pick some of these fights ourselves because, as we know, we've got Labor in and they do not have an appetite to sort of touch things like they're not going to fix the SDA. I mean, they're the ones who put gender identity in. There's no appetite there. So we have to fight this out in the courts. So why can't we go and pick some fights ourselves? And that's where I would like to see common sense defence be a good resource. So if someone had an idea, they had something happen, they can come to us and constantly fundraising so we can assist people with their legal fees, also with respect to sort of media training and all that, because it's really, really hard fighting litigation. It's not for the faint-hearted. And there are some really good organisations over in the United States that have been doing this for decades, and they know what they're doing, and they've picked their battles. And sometimes, they'd run the matter knowing that they were going to lose, but setting up the argument so they might have a dissenting decision that then they can riff off for the next time they bring a
yeah, yeah.
complaint. So I think we need to be more strategic with our litigation on
The
our side of the aisle.
success of the so-called TERFs in the UK was a large part because of their legal work, litigation, cases that they ran.
Mm,
It wasn't just changing the culture. I often say to kind of, you know, center right types here who are fond of that phrase, the politics is downstream from the culture. And I say to
mm,
them, sometimes it is, but sometimes if you change the law, you change the culture. And if you're an
mhm,
HR department in a major corporation, in many cases, you look at the risks on one side and you look at the risks on another, and you have to adjust the policies to mitigate the potential risks from someone filing a suit against you in this way. And if there's no one on the right who's going to file a suit against you, then that's the
mhm.
less the option, and that's why policies are developed. It's not just the culture. There is that, but it's in some ways it's driven by the court cases and legals and everything else. You wouldn't be here in fighting this if there hadn't been a legal change to the law. It's not just people changing their minds. The laws themselves have to be changed. Right? That's the key message.
Yeah. Yeah, well, when you look to the UK, I mean, many of their decisions were sort of in employment law, and in tribunals. I mean, at Mayor Forstater, and then they started bringing their complaints when I think it's Sonia Appleby at Tavistock. We have to remember Maya lost at first instance. Kira Bell essentially, even though she put child transitioning on the map, I mean, essentially she lost.
Mm.
When we look at the Four Women Scotland, I mean, that was a judicial review. The ladies bought that. and they lost in the Court of Sessions, and obviously it went up the chain and they got the decision that they wanted. But, they were strategic. They realized, the Lesbian Alliance group wanting, LGB Alliance, I beg your pardon, their charitable status, they went and picked that fight. They wanted their charitable status and they won. So, they were able to be strategic, and I would like to see that happen here. I mean, you say we're, 5, 10 years behind the UK. Well, I think it's time for us to sort of, stop just talking about it and whinging about it, and actually sort of put the money where our mouth is and maybe start donating to some of these cases, or, if we get common sense defence up and running, and also sort of mobilise people so they can, when there is a parliamentary inquiry, we sort of had a bit of a narrative that we can share with people, saying, if this is your view, here's some tools so you can also make a contribution to the parliamentary inquiry, because people don't really understand. You can write to your MPs, you can ask for a meeting, you can put in a submission, and for many ordinary people it's a bit daunting. But if we're able to sort of set up an organisation where it's a bit of a resource library or whatever, and get people more engaged that way. So that's sort of that's my big vision. That's what I'd like to
Yeah,
have
yeah.
happen. But yeah, with respect to
Yeah, no,
politics,
there's lots of interesting. Oh, sorry, keep going. Yeah, you politics, you
oh, no,
break a story.
yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I mean, if the right opportunity arose, I certainly wouldn't say no, but as I'm sure you can appreciate, I've got quite a bit on my plate at the moment.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I'm glad you do, Katherine, and I appreciate all you do. It's all a matter of like fighting on multiple fronts, legal, yes, write your opinion pages, but also work to seize the levers of power. Get better tech skills, because this is what the left, or people who are
Yeah.
pushing for a different vision do and have done quite well and been committed to it. And it doesn't just happen by accident, which is what often try to. It doesn't just change because the weather changes magically somehow. You got to go in there and
Yeah.
change it yourself. Really appreciate chatting. Thanks again. Have a lovely day, and I look forward to catching up in the future.
Thanks so much for having me on, Dan.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.